Today's project is we are working on a 2011 Nissan Rogue two-wheel drive, front-wheel drive of course. Project today is replacing front brake pads and driver's side and passenger side CV axle. First thing, jack up the vehicle on driver's side and passenger side. Don't forget to use jack stands, because you never know if the jacks will go out on you and probably drop. You wouldn't want that to happen. Here we're changing over to the passenger side, jacking that side up. Remember, every vehicle has a jack point. A lot of times you will see it's marked by an arrow, front and back. And also there's a center jack point as well in the front and rear. You can always look this up under, you can Google it, or if you have the software to look it up, then you'll find it. Using the torque wrench, or power tool, to take the lug nuts off and remove the wheel. That's the passenger side. Moving on to the driver's side. Same thing. A lot of times, most vehicles have all their hubcaps or wheel covers, whatever you want to call it, and sometimes they're missing one. In this case, the passenger side wheel cover was missing. Only the driver's side had one. Alright, moving back to the passenger side. First thing we're going to do is remove the brake caliper. There's going to be two bolts connected to the brake caliper, and the size of that socket is 14 millimeter. A lot of times when working on vehicles that hasn't been worked on for a while, the bolts are going to be a challenge to take off. You could say it's more of a fight to remove or release the bolts. So just be safe and be careful. A lot of times, if you need to, use WD-40 or some kind of lubricant to break it loose. And there you have it, the brake caliper is off. And those are the two 14mm that was removed from it. Note, it's always a good thing to have a magnet plate to save all your nuts and bolts. Put them all together and organize yourself and remember where everything is and everything goes back to when you go back to putting things together. Here we are about to press the brake cylinder in, but before that, what we're going to do is go under the hood and remove the cap to the master brake cylinder. And here we are pressing the brake cylinder in. So when we put the new pads in, you can put that brake caliper right back onto there. And pretty much when you go to the master brake cylinder, when the fluid is low, there's two reasons for it. One is because either your brake pads are worn down and the fluid will show low, or you have a leak in the brake lines. So first thing is always to check if the fluid is low. Check if your brakes pads are worn down. If the brake pads are not worn down, then of course, follow the brake master cylinder to the each wheel and each brake line, and make sure there's no fluid leaks. If you see any wet spots, then you have a really you have an issue. But if the pads are worn down, then simple, just change the pads. Alright, we're about to remove the brake caliper mount that goes on to the knuckle, and that is there's going to be two bolts. It's going to be a 19mm. Once you loosen this out, um, you will be able to remove that piece from the knuckle. And again, the brake pads are still on there, and I'll be pulling those out to show you how bad the brake pads are worn. Yep, they're pretty worn, almost to the metal. If you drive your pads down to the metal, that's a bad sign. They'll start scratching up your rotors, and then you're gonna have to either resurface your rotors or purchase new ones. A lot of times now, it's cheaper to just purchase new rotors than to find somebody to turn your rotors. And that's even still if it's still a spec where you can turn your rotors down. Because sometimes your rotors are too worn out that you can't turn them or service them. I forgot to mention that when you take the brake calipers off, make sure you get something to hang it above. Don't let it just drag or hang down without mounting it up, because the brake lines are connected to it, and you don't want it to tangle or pinch or whatnot. And then next thing, you have brake problems, brake issues. Right now, what I'm doing is taking the cotter pin out. So the cotter pins are always difficult to take out. They're never easy because they've been in there a while, and you bend them to lock in place. So when you remove that, a lot of times you'll break it, and that's just that right there. I just showed was a crown that goes over the centered nut of the CV axle, and then you got a 32 millimeter socket that will go over that nut, and then you just remove that. And you can either get a rubber mallet, or sometimes it's pretty loose, it'll just come loose like that one is. But if sometimes it's rusted in there and it's gonna fight, you just get a rubber mallet and just beat it in, and it'll break loose. So here what I'm doing is removing the knuckle from the struts, the suspension, and then it's two nuts and bolts that just needs to be removed, and they're 19 millimeters on the top on both sides. Once you release the nut, the bolts just needs to be knocked out of there. Sometimes it's simple, and sometimes it gives you a little challenge. But once you release that knuckle will be loose from the top, and then you'll be able to pull that axle right out of that knuckle. Here you have the bolt and nuts. I like to put them together so later when I assemble everything, I know where they go and what nuts and bolts goes to where. Make sure you be careful. The line that's above the knuckle and the axle is actually the ABS cable to the ABS sensor, to the speed sensor of the axle or wheel bearing. So just be careful that doesn't get ruined. And on the passenger side CV axle, it's going to be longer from the driver's side because the transmission sits on the driver's side of the vehicle. So it just makes sense that the CV axle is longer on the passenger side and needs a longer reach. So the CV axle has the passenger side has a center mount, and that's what I'm doing right here. And it's going to be a 12. Actually, it's a 13 millimeter. 13 millimeter, two bolts that's mounting a lock plate for that center of that CV axle. And I'm shining the light at the bottom bolt there. And again, 13 millimeter. And it's only hand tight, so you will be able to break it loose with your hand. You don't need extender or whatnot. And with this 13mm socket, you're going to need an extension because it is pretty far down in there. Once you release this 13mm, the two 13mm bolts, that that lock plate bracket will come loose. And there you have it. Now, from this point, you have to go underneath where the transmission and the axle meets, get a pry bar, and you're going to have to pry that away from the transmission. And keep in mind, there's going to be transmission fluid leaking out of it. Not a lot, but enough. So make sure you get a catch pan for that fluid. And there you have it, the passenger CV axle. Alright, moving on to the driver's side. Same procedure, but there won't be a center mount for this axle because the CV axle is actually shorter because the transmission sits on the driver's side. So first thing we do, like we did on the other side, is disassemble the brake caliper, the brakes, the pads, the rotors, the center CV axle bolt, and the suspension from the knuckle. First thing is the 14mm bolts that connects to the brake caliper. Press the brake caliper master cylinder in, so when you replace the new pads it will fit right on it. As you can see, the brake fluid is leaking from the top down. When you press, the fluid will fill up into the master cylinder, brake master cylinder canister. And again, find something to mount or hang the brake calipers up, because again, you don't want the brake lines to pinch or tear or ruin. Releasing the brake pads, those are pretty bad. Next, 19mm, two 19mm bolts. So since this is a tight spot, and a lot of time the bolts are going to be really tight, and you can't get a breaker bar in there, or any leverage. What I usually do is I get a rubber hammer and kind of like tap the tool so it breaks the bolt loose, and then once the bolts are broke loose, then you can just twist them by hand or by tool. That way you don't stress yourself out. And there you have it, two 19mm bolts. And then remove the rotor. When doing a job like this, there's no really procedure of what weighs or what comes off first or what comes off last or whatnot. Um, as long as you know what you're doing, uh, and be safe about it, you know, the whole goal is to replace whatever needs to be replaced. So right now we're taking the cotter pin off. I'm bending it straight so I can tap it out. And then take the center nut cover off. Now I'm going to go ahead and take the knuckle, two knuckle bolts and nuts off the from the connection from the struts suspension to the knuckle. Sometimes you get pretty lucky when you release it, loosen up a nut and bolt, and then everything just kind of comes out easily without any fighting or pressure. Just tap and it's released. Makes the job easier that way. And again, remember, put everything together that goes together. Organize yourself. It makes the job a lot more easier for you when you put everything back together. Here I am releasing the center nut. If you don't have an impact wrench, and these are torqued down pretty good, so if you don't have an impact wrench, it's always good to, before taking the wheel off, when the wheel sits on the ground, loosen up that center nut, and then you can proceed. Now I'm taking the knuckle off the struts, tapping the CV axle out of the knuckle, and there you have it. Sometimes you can just pull and tap it out and it'll release, or you can pry it out from the axle and the transmission. So here we have it. We're pulling the CV axle out. So both of these CV axles that needed to be replaced on the driver and passenger side, the boot was torn and all the grease came out. So when you're turning, it'll start clicking or making a knocking noise. That's the old part, and then the new parts are in the package. Back in the old days, they would just replace the boot. They would have a boot replacement kit, but nowadays parts have become a lot cheaper, where it's all reman and stuff like that. You can buy the whole part assembled and just remove and put back in. And there you have it, old and the new.